Okay, let's dive into this. When you picture George Washington, you probably see, that stoic face on the $1 bill, or maybe that flawless commander crossing the Delaware. We're all taught the legend, right? But we rarely get to see the actual man behind the marble. In this explainer, we're going to dismantle that towering mythological aura by looking directly at the historical data. We'll uncover the surprising truth about where he actually laid his head at night, and we'll dive into a spectacularly humiliating political defeat that textbooks almost always gloss over.
Let's start with a seemingly simple question. Where did President Washington actually live while in office? Now, if you guessed Washington, D.C., well, you'd be falling for one of the greatest geographical paradoxes in American history. His name is literally everywhere. It's the capital city, a whole state, universities, streets, you name it. But the man himself? He never actually lived in Washington, D.C. The district was established shortly after he became president, replacing Philadelphia as the capital, thanks to the Residence Act of 1790. But just because of the timeline of its construction, the father of the country never got to call his namesake city home.
The historical irony here is just staggering. See, Washington actually picked the physical location for the iconic White House. He was absolutely instrumental in its planning, oversaw its construction between 1791 and 1800, but he never spent a single night in it as president. No, that honor actually went to his successor, John Adams, who became the very first resident. Instead, Washington's absolute favorite place to hang his hat was the President's House in Philadelphia. It was this 3-story brick building that he proudly described as the best single house in the city. He was definitely a man with refined tastes, but as you'll see, his presidential real estate portfolio was surprisingly impermanent.
Let's move to and see how this builds, because this paradox resulted in an almost nomadic presidency. During his 2 terms, from 1789 to 1797, Washington had 3 different primary residences. He actually started out in New York City at the Samuel Osgood House. Then, when the much larger Alexander Macomb House, which had this beautiful view overlooking the Hudson River, became vacant in 1790, he packed up and moved there. But he only stayed for 6 months. After the Residence Act passed, he packed up the whole shebang yet again and moved down to the President's House in Philadelphia, where he stayed until his presidency ended in 1797. So the man who grounded an entire nation spent his own presidency practically living out of boxes, dealing with landlords and constantly moving.
And speaking of landlords, consider this incredibly modern stressor. $845. It's so easy to think of Washington as this monarch-like figure, living in palaces gifted to him by a grateful nation. But the reality? Congress had to act almost like his real estate broker. When Washington first arrived in New York for his inauguration, Congress actually rented the Samuel Osgood House for him for exactly $845 a year. It really grounds this monolithic figure into the highly relatable stress of housing. He wasn't sitting in some hereditary castle. He was living in a rented house that the nascent federal government was leasing by the year.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is Washington's own attitude towards all this moving around, which is remarkably humble. Right before arriving in New York for his inauguration in 1789, he wrote a letter to James Madison asking for help finding lodgings. He explicitly said, "I mean to go into none but hired ones. If these cannot be had tolerably convenient, I would take rooms in the most decent tavern." I mean, this isn't the voice of an arrogant conqueror demanding a palace. This is the voice of a practical, totally exhausted man who just wanted a convenient place to sleep, even if that literally meant bunking above a local bar. It's a beautifully humanizing admission of travel fatigue.
All right, so we've punctured the myth of his grand domestic life. But now we really need to make a hard pivot to tackle a much bigger assumption, the myth of invincibility. Because we know Washington is the victorious general of the Revolution and the unanimously elected first president, we naturally kind of assume he possessed a golden touch, right? We assume he was universally beloved and effortlessly successful from the very moment he stepped into the public eye. But if we were to rewind the clock to his early days, the data tells a vastly different and honestly far more embarrassing story.
To set the stage, we have to go all the way back to 1755. Long before the presidency, a young George Washington decided he wanted to enter politics. His target? The House of Burgesses, representing Frederick County, Virginia. Now, this was a monumental deal. It was the first democratically elected legislative body in what would eventually become the United States. In a letter to his brother John Augustine Washington, George confidently announced his intention to run for office. He was a young military man, he was ambitious, and he was absolutely ready to take his rightful place in leadership. So the election happens, the votes are tallied.
He got 40 votes. Just take a second to let that sink in. The father of our country, the guy whose face is carved in a Mount Rushmore.
In his very first attempt at capturing the hearts and minds of the American voter, he managed to convince exactly 40 people to support him. It wasn't just a loss, it was a devastating, totally humiliating rejection by his own community.
The numbers from that election are absolutely brutal. Hugh West completely dominated with 271 votes. Thomas Swearingen was right behind him in a real nail-biter with 270, and then, way down at the bottom, barely even registering on the political radar, is George Washington with just 40 votes. His rivals completely towered over him. He wasn't even a close third. He was totally out of his league, a political nobody who had just been handed a very profound lesson in public opinion.
But Washington wasn't one to quit. 3 years later, in July of 1758, he ran again, resulting in a stunning reversal of fortune. And this brilliantly illustrates his massive comeback. Washington surged to 307 votes, easily defeating Colonel Martin, who had 240, and completely unseating the incumbent Hugh West, who fell to 199 votes. He went from a humiliating 40 votes to absolute victory in just 3 years. But how did he do it? I mean, did he suddenly become a masterful orator? Did he draft some brilliant, visionary policy platform?
Not exactly. So, the crucial point is that his triumph was largely thanks to a highly relatable, heavily alcohol-fueled strategy. Historians note that his 1758 victory was, in large part, a beer-heavy campaign. He basically threw a massive party and lubricated the electorate with drinks to win their favor. It's hilarious, it's pragmatic, and it is intensely human. And perhaps even more revealing is the deeply humanizing fact that Washington actually kept that original poll sheet from his humiliating 1755 loss for the rest of his entire life. The man who had become a legend never allowed himself to forget what it felt like to be completely rejected at the very bottom of the ballot.
Which brings us to our final thought. George Washington didn't live in some flawless marble temple. He was a stressed-out renter bouncing from house to house. He wasn't born politically invincible. He had to buy his neighbor's beer just to recover from a humiliating 40-vote defeat. By looking past the marble and examining the actual historical data, we see a man who is so much more interesting than the myth. It leaves you wondering, if the ultimate historical hero had such a messy, relatable, and honestly flawed start, what other fascinating human realities are hiding right behind the grand myths we've been taught to accept? Keep questioning the legends, because the real history is always a much better story.